All right. Well, I wanted to talk to you about another subject again. I think with this coronavirus that a lot of us are struggling with, or a lot of people, and that is um, we're afraid. A lot of people are just scared. My wife was telling me about some people on her workplace's website that were just talking about they can't even work. They're too upset. They're really afraid. And a lot of times we get so afraid because, quite frankly, we place limitations on ourselves that maybe aren't really real. Somebody said fear is false evidence that appears real. And so many times we operate in fear, and because of fear, we place limitations on ourselves. And you probably know this. I mean, we've all placed limitations on ourselves, right? You've probably said things like this: man, I'm not going to eat any more cookies after these last two, right? You place a limitation on yourself. You're like, I'm going to go to bed by 10 o'clock. I'm not going to stay up past 10 o'clock and things like that. During this virus outbreak, you might be putting limitations like, I'm only going to go out if I have to go to the grocery store. Or maybe you've said, I'm not going to leave my house. I'm just not leaving my house. I'm not going to go out. So you've placed those limitations on ourselves. So a lot of times when we're afraid of something, we'll place limitations. Like we're afraid to eat more than the 2 cookies because we're going to get heavier, right? So we're like, I'm stopping at 2 cookies. Or we're afraid if we don't go to bed by 10 o'clock, then the next day we're going to be so groggy and not able to do our work. So we say, okay, I'm going to stop at 10 o'clock, stop playing my games. I'm going to limit my online time. I'm going to go to bed. We place those limitations on ourselves because we're afraid of what happens if we go beyond those limitations. Of course, the reality is we usually can go further than we think we can, okay? We place limitations on ourselves, but usually we can go further than we think we can. Like, I mean, you can really eat more than 2 cookies, right? You can really stay up past 10 o'clock if you wanted to, right? I read about a 42-year-old secretary that was into running, and she was going to run the 10K. She got to the starting line 15 minutes early, and she noticed people were lining up. So she thought, must be starting early. So she lined up with everybody else, and the gun went off, and she started running. Well, she realized a few minutes into the run that they took a turn that they weren't supposed to take. And she began to ask people, isn't this the 10K run? So they're sitting there running along, and she's like, we were supposed to turn there. Isn't this the 10K run? And they said, no, the 10K run started 15 minutes later. This is the 26-mile marathon. You're in the wrong race. Now, here's this lady who had trained for the 10K. Now she finds herself in the marathon. So guess what she does? She's like, all right, I'll go for it. And believe it or not, she ran the entire marathon. She finished 83rd. But she, in the women's division, but she finished a marathon. She thought she could only run a 10K, and she ended up running 26.2 miles. I mean, so here's the thing. Many times our fears, we stop at our fears and we put limitations because of those fears. But in reality, we can go beyond what we think we can do. We can do more than we really think we can do. But the reason we place those limitations is because we're afraid of negative consequences, or we're afraid of being embarrassed, or afraid of failure. So we place those limitations and those barriers in front of us because we don't want to go past that, because we're afraid of what can happen. Now, right now, we're in this COVID-19 crisis, and there's a lot of panic and there's a lot of fear. And so I want to challenge you this morning. If you're a Christ follower, I want to challenge you this morning to don't let your fear override your faith. Don't let your fear override your faith. So this morning, I want to challenge you with that, because it's so easy for us to allow fear to override our faith. And I don't want you to do that this morning. So my challenge to you today is don't let your fear override your faith. And so we're going to talk about that this morning, and we're going to take a look at a great passage of Scripture, and we're going to talk about how do we allow fear to override our faith, and why do we allow fear to override our faith. So if you have your Bibles, you can turn with me this morning to Mark chapter 5. Mark chapter 5. We were in Mark last week, by the way. Mark is the second gospel in the New Testament. The Bible's divided into two parts, the Old Testament or the Old Covenant, and then there's the New Testament or the New Covenant. Today we live under the New Covenant because of Jesus Christ and his death on the cross and resurrection. And so we live under the New Covenant. And I want you to turn to Mark chapter 5. It's the second gospel. And we're just going to take a look at this for just a second here in Mark chapter 5 this morning. So look at this. It said, when Jesus had crossed over by boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him while he was by the sea. Keep going. One of the synagogue leaders named Jairus came, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet and kept begging him, "My little daughter is at death's door. Come lay your hands on her so she will get well and live." Now, here's the deal. Here's the deal. Jesus was on the Sea of Galilee. He'd been on the west side, was a Galilee side, and on the east side is what's called the Decapolis side. Deca means 10. It's the side of 10 cities. And so Jesus had been on the west side right before this story. He had cast out a demon from a man, demon-possessed man, and then he got into the boat and he goes over to the east side here on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. And the Sea of Galilee is only about 4 miles wide at its widest point. So what happened was a lot of people moved from the west side to the east side to where Jesus was. And where he was at on the west side prior to this was up towards the top. So they didn't have a real long way to go. So Jesus had cast out this demon over on the west side and the Galilee side. He'd gotten into a boat. He'd gone over to the east side. A lot of the people had gone around the lake because they were hungry to hear more from Jesus. And so that's where this story starts. And so when Jesus gets over to the east side of the Sea of Galilee, he has this man named Jairus who comes out to him. Now, Jairus is like any parent. He's a concerned parent. We know that this daughter, Luke tells us in Luke's account that this is his only daughter. And we also know later in Mark's account and also in Luke's account that she was 12 years old. So she's a 12-year-old little girl. This is his only daughter. And Jairus is scared to death because, as he says here in our text, my little daughter is at death's door. Now, let me tell you some more about this guy as you see in the text. Jairus was one of the synagogue leaders. And if you know a little bit about Jewish history, you had these gathering places called the synagogue. Now, the main worship place was the temple in Jerusalem. But all around that area there in Palestine, you had these synagogues where the Jews would gather on Saturday, which was their Sabbath. But they also used the synagogue throughout the week where they trained children in the Torah and they did teachings in the Torah, which is the Old Testament law, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the Torah. So they would do training throughout the week at the synagogue. Now, Jairus was one of the leaders at the synagogue. And what the leaders of the synagogue would often do is they would organize these meetings. Sometimes they would do instruction at these meetings. They were responsible for making the synagogue sure the synagogue was kept up. And they also made sure that the Torah scrolls were kept up and properly handled and things like that. They would make announcements. So he was one of the guys there in the synagogue who was responsible for making sure the synagogue was kept up, the people were being taught, there were the gatherings. So he was a leader in the synagogue. So in other words, in that community where Jesus is, Jairus is a very important man. He's a very important man. And the problem, though, with Jesus and the synagogues was Jesus didn't always have good reception with the synagogues. Now, Jesus, and later like Paul, would often start, when he'd go to a new city, the first place he would go to was the synagogue. The reason Jesus would start at the synagogue, and later Paul, was that's where the religious people were. That's where the people who were seeking to know about God. And so Jesus, a lot of times in his ministry, when he would go to a town, he would go to the synagogue. And yet, Jesus had some bad experiences at the synagogue. For example, in Luke chapter 4, when Jesus went to the synagogue in his hometown, which was Nazareth, he made the people really, really mad because he read Isaiah's prophecy and he said, today, this prophecy is being fulfilled in your midst. And Matthew tells us that the people of his hometown there in Nazareth at the synagogue were offended by Jesus. They were offended by his statements like that. They were offended by him in the synagogue. We also know in John chapter 6, when Jesus was in the synagogue at Capernaum, which, by the way, was over on the west upper tier of the Sea of Galilee, which was probably the area that Jesus just came from, that the synagogue leaders in Capernaum were not happy with Jesus, because there in John chapter 6, he had these teachings that just seemed to be crazy, where he's like, unless you eat the flesh and drink my blood, you'll have no part of me. And so to the Jewish mind, that was like blasphemy. What are you saying? And in fact, if you read John chapter 6, verse 66, incidentally, it said at that time, many of his disciples no longer walked with him. So when Jesus had been at the synagogue there in Capernaum, just on the other side of the lake, on the west side, a lot of people had left him. And so you got to think that Jairus, being a synagogue leader, probably talked to other synagogue leaders, because I'm sure there were times when they got together or they sent letters back and forth. And I'm sure Jairus had heard all about Jesus, and Jairus had probably heard from other synagogue leaders how they weren't happy with Jesus and they were offended by Jesus. So you have to understand that Jairus going up to Jesus, this is a huge deal. I mean, he is risking his reputation. He's risking perhaps maybe his livelihood on this by going up to Jesus, because a lot of the synagogue leaders did not like Jesus. But Jairus is like us. He's a concerned parent. And you know, when you're a concerned parent, you'll go beyond what you think you can do. And so Jairus, he throws the limitations aside. He's like, I'm going to Jesus. My 12-year-old daughter, my only daughter, is at home near death's door. And so I'm going to seek out this man. So Jairus leaves where he's at. He goes over to the lake where Jesus has gotten out of the boat. He's desperate. He needs help for his daughter. And it took a lot of faith for him to do this. I mean, he believed that Jesus could heal his daughter. So he's willing to forsake his reputation, his friends, his family, because he needs help from Jesus. Now, here's the issue. Even though Jairus made this trip to see Jesus, and even though Jairus is risking his reputation, and I hate to criticize Jairus, because Jairus, what he does next, shows us a few things that subconsciously Jairus is still allowing fear to overrule his faith. Subconsciously, he's leaning to that. And here's the thing. My challenge to you this morning is, don't let fear overrule your faith, because many times we do allow our fear to overrule our faith. And you say, well, how do we do that, Jim? How do we allow fear to overrule our faith? Well, let me give you some examples of some ways we allow fear to overrule our faith. First of all, we allow fear to overrule our faith when we subconsciously, and a lot of times if you're a Christ follower, like, I would never do this, but subconsciously, by what we say and what we do, we tend to limit God's ability. Now, when I say that, I mean, you and I can't limit what God can do. But in our minds, we're limiting what we really think God can do, what we're really thinking God can do. I mean, again, you go back to the text here and look at the text here. He says, my daughter is at death's door. Come, lay your hands on her so that she can get well. Here's the limiting factor, okay? Jairus believes that the only way for his daughter to be healed is if she's still alive when Jesus shows up. Because again, if she dies and Jesus doesn't make it there in time, well, it's all over. At least in Jairus' mind, he's limited God's ability because he thinks that Jesus can only heal her as long as she's alive. And again, look, don't get all over him, because the reality is resurrection then, as now, is not common. I have never seen anybody rise from the dead. Doubt you have either. Okay, people just don't get up and rise from the dead. So again, in Jairus' mind, he's thinking the only way for my daughter to get healed is if Jesus comes and heals her. Now, I want you to look at what happens next here. It says this: so Jesus went with him, and a large crowd was following and pressing against him. So again, you got to think, here's Jesus. He's like, okay, Jairus, I'll go. So Jairus is like, yes, ka-ching, he's going to do this. My daughter's going to be saved. And so Jesus is walking, but the people are just like, woof. Okay, this is like Jesus is a rock star at this point, even though the religious leaders don't care for him. The people, by and large, they love Jesus because he's healing the sick. His teachings are just like mind-blowing. And so the crowd just gloms onto him. And so Jesus is trying to walk in this crowd. And you've probably seen that, celebrities and all the people around him, and they're trying to walk, and, people are trying to move them out of the way. And so Jesus is like, okay, Jairus, let's go. And so they start walking towards where Jairus lives, but you have this crowd. Now, right in the middle of this is a very interesting story, and I want you to look at this story. So Jesus is walking along, and here's what happens. It says, a woman suffering from bleeding for about 12 years had endured much under many doctors. She spent everything she had and was not helped at all. On the contrary, she became worse. Having heard about Jesus, she came behind him in the crowd and touched his robe, for she said, if I can just touch his robes, I will be made well. So here's this lady, and again, a big crowd of people around Jesus, and this Mark hones in on the story of this one lady who's had this issue for 12 years. And in fact, this is kind of interesting. She had been sick for the same amount of time as Jairus' daughter had been alive. Remember, Jairus' daughter, Mark will tell us later, was 12 years old. For the same amount of time, this woman had this issue of blood for 12 years, same amount of time. And in this woman's mind, Jesus is her last hope. She had been to the doctors. She had spent everything she had. The doctors weren't able to help her. And so in her mind, she's like, if I can just get in that crowd, if I can just touch him, I don't need to talk to him. In fact, I don't want to talk to him. If I can just touch him, then maybe something will happen. And so here she is. She's just another person in that crowd, but she's kind of working her way through the crowd. She's trying to get up there by Jesus. She doesn't want anybody to know anything. She's just thinking all of this in her head, and she's having all this internal dialogue with herself that maybe Jesus can handle her, can help her. So she gets up there, and look at what happens. She touches Jesus' robe, and instantly the flow of blood ceased, and she sensed in her body that she was cured. Now, again, nobody around her knew this. She hadn't told anybody. She was probably very embarrassed about her medical condition. So she was just a person that just reached up and touched, didn't say anything. But here's the thing, and I don't want to be critical. Jairus was seeking out Jesus to heal his only daughter, and yet subconsciously he was allowing fear to override his faith because he felt that Jesus had to be there before she died. And this woman, who is unidentified, we don't know her name, even though she's showing great faith by touching Jesus and believing, subconsciously she's also allowing some fear to overrule her faith. You'd say, how is that, Jim? She's subconsciously limiting God's knowledge. In other words, subconsciously she had set up a limitation. Okay, she thought maybe, I can do this and God won't know. Maybe I can touch Jesus, I can get healed, and Jesus won't know anything about it. And again, a lot of times when we allow fear to overrule our faith, It's because subconsciously we're limiting what we think God really knows. We're thinking God doesn't know about our trials. We're thinking God doesn't know about the fact that we just got laid off because of COVID-19. We're thinking maybe that God doesn't know that we're really afraid because we've got some other underlying issue, so we don't want to go outside. We're thinking that God doesn't really know that we're concerned about our finances and how we're going to make it through this. And so many times we limit God and we allow fear to overrule our faith because subconsciously we're limiting what we think God really knows about our situation. But look at what happens here in the text here, because again, she's really limiting God's knowledge. And look at what happens though. At once, Jesus realized in himself that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my robes?" Now, if you had been there in the crowd and Jesus said, "Who touched me?" you would have been like, "Oh man, Jesus, there are people touching you all over. We're getting jostled around here." And in fact, his disciples, they have that reaction, right? And you would have had that reaction too. Here's what the disciples said. His disciples said, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and yet you say, 'Who touched me?'" Come on, Jesus. Now, obviously, they also subconsciously were limiting God's knowledge. You see, it wasn't that Jesus didn't know. Jesus was hoping that the woman would come forward so that he would have the opportunity to talk to her face to face, that he would have the opportunity to love on her. Something, because you have to think, she had been struggling with this for 12 years. She had basically lived somewhat of an isolated life because this is a very embarrassing situation. Obviously, she probably struggled with just lack of energy due to anemia and loss of blood and all those things. And so she was probably lived in somewhat seclusion because of this illness. She just wanted to touch and get out of there. And Jesus was wanting to talk to her, to have a face-to-face encounter with her, to love on her. He knew who had touched him. He's God. But she subconsciously was limiting his knowledge, saying, if I can just touch and get out, he won't know. But he does know. The disciples were subconsciously limiting Christ's knowledge when he asked that question. The proper answer would have been, "Lord, you know who touched you." But again, we're like, God's knowledge is not to think that God doesn't know what you're thinking, but he knows the questions, he knows that you know yourself.
Let's just go